Yes, and yeah, so here I also forgot to mention, for those that might be interested specifically on the coaching program, we've got some exciting news. We're going to be sharing a link with those that might be interested on that towards the end of the session, how you can also join our mentorship and coaching program, which is currently online, needless to say, with the pandemic. So just feel free to engage, and I hope you enjoy the session. We've got something very interesting that we're going to be sharing today. So over to you, Suhail. I see you ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Truman. I'm just checking if you can all see the first slide.
Yes, we can.
All right, so the first 3 slides, I think, Truman, you will be running us through, and then I will take on from slide 4.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Suhail. So essentially, like I said, in terms of project and change management, this is indeed a short program, a short course. However, if you want to take it to the next level, if you need a full qualification or a full program, we are going to be giving you the details. I think most of you might have also seen the details on the advert. So if you are interested on the course certificate, there's a separate process for that. So this session is indeed free of charge. However, if you want to get a course certificate, then you'll have to pay a fee for that as per the advert. I would also share the details through the chat for those of you that might be interested on that. Over and above that, the coaching program. The fact that you are actually part of this call, you are then, going to be considered for those that are interested in the coaching program. But we'll suggest that you give us an indication if you are interested or not, so that, in terms of the link that we're going to be sharing, we can then make that available to you. So without any further ado, I would like to end it at that for now. Over to you, Suhail.
Thank you. So the presentation tonight centers around project and change management. And just in terms of some basic house rules and expectations, it is not a one-way lecture. Please feel free to interact. I'll be very happy if you wish to have a interactive questions as we go along. Also, in terms of time management, Truman will keep track of that, and he will, put me on track if I'm taking too long with something or if there is time for a break. The code of conduct here is very informal, so please feel at home and feel welcome. I remember with my team, when I was working, I had one rule with them, and I would say, please ask questions. And I would say the only stupid question may be the ones that you don't ask. You mustn't feel shy to ask any question. So please bear that in mind. And everything is negotiable. And only cell phones, if you can put them on silence or switch them off so that we don't get interrupted during the session. And if there's anything that you'd like repeated or explained further, please feel free to ask, for further explanation. Are there any of the audience who would like to share any of your expectations from the session? If not, we can carry on. So the first part of the presentation, there are three parts to this. The first part is focusing on understanding and analyzing aspects of projects in organizations. We're going to look at supply chain relationships a little bit. We will look at resources for projects and also the life cycle of projects. But to begin with, when we talk about aspects of projects in organizations, I thought it might be good just to have a basic understanding of what do we mean by a project and what do we mean by an organization. I copied a couple of explanations that I liked. The first one on the left there, you see it is from the British Standards Institute. Project is a unique set of coordinated activities with defined starting and finishing points, undertaken by an individual or organization to meet specific objectives with defined schedule, cost, and performance parameters. So this is very typical. Also, the American Project Management Institute, PMBOK definition, is kind of similar to this. But then there was another one I came across, which is below that, which I thought I would also like to share. It says projects are the method by which organizations respond to their environment. And perhaps later on, you will see why I like this in particular, because we are talking now about projects and organizations and change. And they say one of the best ways that organizations respond to change is actually by doing projects. So what is an organization then? You can see some examples there of different types of organizations, government or public organizations, private organizations, special interest organizations. Basically, an organization is any organized group of people who have a common goal and work together. By the way, you may notice in the slides there are these sort of light gray text. I've tried to put all the references from where I got these definitions or sources of information so that you can click on those and it should take you to the source. Some examples of projects. You have different types of projects here. They are talking about 9+ types. For example, administrative projects. It's like in a company, you want to install a new accounting system. Of course, we are all familiar with infrastructure or construction type projects where a road or a bridge or a new hospital gets built. But then number 6, for example, is interesting, an event or relocation, Olympiads or a move into a new building. So those could also be regarded as a project. People who are into event management, who organize weddings and the like, each of those could be regarded as a project. Now, an important aspect of when we talk about organizations, organizations center around the concept of stakeholders. And so here is a definition of stakeholder before we start analyzing them. A stakeholder can be defined as a person with an interest or concern in something, especially a business. And when we look at corporations, and this goes back to the history of where did the term stakeholder come from, apparently back in 1963, the Stanford Research Institute, or SRI, used the term in an internal memo where they were referring to groups without whose support the organization would cease to exist. So you can see that a stakeholder is a member of this group, which is a very important group, because without the support of that group, you really wouldn't have the organization anymore. Later on in the 1980s, Edward Freeman developed this idea of stakeholders further. And we can see that, if we look at examples of stakeholders, For example, in terms of what is relevant to our discussion, you could think of customers. Their interest is around product or service quality and value. In an organization, the employees, they are interested in employment, income, and safety. The investors, they would be more interested in financial returns. You have suppliers and vendors who are interested in revenues and perhaps safety. The communities where projects may be implemented, they are interested in health and safety, in economic development. And also the government, they may be interested as a stakeholder in taxes and GDP and so on. So in this slide, we have something called the power and interest matrix, which is basically looking at the level of interest of different stakeholders on the horizontal axis and the level of power or influence that these stakeholders may have. And different people over the years have looked at this, but here we are looking at Mendelow that originally suggested such a matrix in 1981. And you can see that there are 4 quadrants to this matrix. We start at the bottom left with low interest and low power. And then next to that on the right-hand side, you can have low power but high interest. Then on top left, we have a group with a high power but low interest. And then finally, on the right-hand side of that, we have a group with high power and high interest. And here in the next diagram from Johnson and Scholes from 1999, they are giving some examples that, for example, the high power and high interest, these are key players that really we must engage them very closely. The opposite of that, the low power and low interest group, they're the least important. We need minimal effort to maintain them. If we go further, here I've got an example. BMW did a stakeholder analysis, and you can see in terms of their business, for example, their key players are customers, competitors, the key shareholders, partners, which are, including their distributors and executives. So for this group, you have to give them the most attention and communication and keep them fully informed and engaged. Whereas they say, for example, with the general public, it's a minimal effort. You just provide your literature and you keep them informed of the models coming. But apart from that, it's not much more that you need to do. Now, in terms of project implementation, an essential step for the implementation of projects in or by any organization is the procurement aspect, because projects need resources, and resources don't just come automatically. They need to be obtained or procured or bought. Similarly with services. And when we talk of resources, the basic types of resources could be like materials, equipment, human resources, financial resources, expertise, and so on. Therefore, this procurement process itself may be regarded as a project which has its own life cycle. So when we talk about a procurement project life cycle, it is slightly different to what we will later on be referring to as a project life cycle. We start with the strategic stage, then we go to the initiation, the planning, design, followed by a bid award, then the build or construction stage, and finally close out. If we look at, this came from Lyson and Farrington 2016, and they actually updated that publication, I think in 2020, the 10th edition. But here is a diagram from that, where for each stage, I'm sorry that the diagram is not extremely clear, but I will explain to you these steps under each stage, they are indicating, the activities that take place. For example, in the strategic phase, you start with the strategic plan or the funding plan. That is to be followed by project justification and proposal. Then you go to the funds or the grants identification. And finally, in this phase, you do the project proposal approval. And once you've done that, then you can go to the next phase, which is the initiation phase. In the initiation phase, you establish the project charter. Then after the project charter, you go and do the project budget allocation. Then you do the project charter approval, and here you have the project kickoff meeting. After that, you go through the planning phase. In the planning phase, you develop the project management plan. Then you do a project plan review. That will be followed by a project management plan. Then you go now into the design and implementation, which is this darker blue shade. So in the design phase, you develop in the design phase, you select your designer. Then you go through the design stages. And here we have preliminary design, conceptual design, and so on. So first you start with a conceptual design. And at the conceptual design stage, you have about only 5% of the details worked out. You then go to the preliminary design where you detail about 30% of the details. After that, you go into interim, which is 60%. You then go to pre-final, which is at 90%. And eventually you reach final, which is 100% of the design. So that is probably one of the longer activities of the whole cycle. And once you have finished your design, now you obviously have to do a review and approval. And this is what they have used the terminology, whether it is camera ready or not. Once it is ready, then you go to the bid award phase. And here the procurement of the construction contract starts, the bid opening, and then the award of the construction contract. Once it has been awarded, you then go to the build and construction stage. And in the build and construction stage, you do the team kickoff. Once the team is formed, you then go through the actual construction phase and review. Once it is completed, you then go through a check whether the build or construction is complete and acceptable. And after that, it is the project approval review that the whole project has been implemented as required. And finally, you go to the closeout where the project is closed both financially and administratively and contractually. So that's a sort of a detailed way of going through a typical example of what we mean by that. Now, when we implement projects in organizations, the actual purchasing or procurement side of the organization is going through some kind of a development. Professor Van Wiel, Rosemeyer, and Rietveld, they came up with a paper in around 2010, I think, where they looked at a number of organizations that had been undertaking projects, and they were particularly focusing on what happens with the development of their procurement or purchasing or supply chain management unit. And of course, they looked at different size organizations. The smaller organizations start with a very basic approach to their purchasing requirements. And then as time goes on and as organizations get larger, you find that the purchasing unit goes through its own developmental stages. So this slide and the next one examine some of those. And Van Wiel and colleagues found out from their research that they can look at 6 stages of development in terms of the development of the purchasing unit. You start with a transaction orientation. Initially, you go through a commercial orientation and so on. So for example, in the transaction orientation stage, and they were very much looking at a manufacturing type of organization. Their focus was, serving the factory. In other words, they have a factory that is producing some products, and the purchasing people have to focus on finding appropriate suppliers and making sure that the plant does not run out of raw materials and the supplied components. When the organization gets a bit more mature, their orientation becomes a commercial orientation, which is a lowest unit price focus. Here, the proactive type of purchasing manager is recruited, and they can negotiate with suppliers for lower prices. Then as they develop further, they go to what is called coordinated purchasing. Now in coordinated purchasing, it is led by a very strong central purchasing department that implements uniform buying policies and systems. And the emphasis here is on cross-unit coordination and compliance with nationally negotiated contracts. So you can see it's a much more mature organization and possibly a larger size organization. In stage 4, which is called internal integration, cross-functional purchasing is the focus. At this stage, the emphasis is on cross-functional problem solving with the objective of reducing total system cost and not just the unit cost of the purchase components. So they're looking, at the bigger picture, if you like. After that, if we look at the 5th stage of development, it is called external integration, as opposed to the previous one, which was internal. So now the supply chain management comes in, and at this stage, it is characterized by outspoken outsourcing strategy combined with extra attention for cooperation with supply partners on product development and pre-production planning. So a lot more planning and coordination goes into it. And finally, the value chain orientation or approach comes in, where the purchasing strategy is based on the recognition that most important for success is delivering value to the end customer. So now they look at the whole value chain and not just getting the cheapest material for the factory. There is a diagram in the same reference, which is on our next slide. Here they show the 6 stages in this form, and you can see between stage 3 and 4, there is a gap, and there's a lot of repetition and going back and forth. And you can see initially there is a slow development, then it goes up quite quickly in stage 2, then it kind of gets gradual, and there is this whole repetition. And then again, we enter another slow cycle followed by a sharp rise, followed by another gradual development. So these things can take a lot of time, and once the organization becomes well experienced in one stage, then they shift to the next one. Another idea we want to become familiar with is this idea of consortiums and joint ventures. Whenever we implement projects in organizations, the contractors or the service providers for these projects are typically either individual companies, or sometimes they join forces in the form of a joint venture, which is typically 2, sometimes maybe more than 2, but a lot of time it is 2 entities, like 2 companies. They form a legal entity which, you know, to which they contribute in terms of equity and sharing of the expenses. And this entity, the JV, undertakes the economic activity, you know, together. Another way that service providers tackle, you know, bidding for contracts is through a consortium, which is an association of individuals or organizations who pool their resources to participate in a common activity to achieve a common goal. So you may well ask, what is really the difference between a consortium and a joint venture? And one of the sources that I looked up indicates that a consortium is basically an association of two or more entities, whether they are individuals or companies or organizations or governments. And their objective is to participate in a common activity, but they are basically sharing resources, and the lead partner in the consortium is usually the responsible party in terms of the contract. Whereas in a joint venture, a new legal entity, the JV, is formed, and all the participants in that joint venture, legally speaking, are equally and, as they say, jointly and severally responsible for delivering the contract. So the JV in its own entity legally is separate from the participants. And that is a main difference also from the consortium. Now, if we look at the resources that these projects require, we mentioned earlier that projects you know, require resources such as people, expertise, financial capital, material goods, equipment, plant, you know, and so on. And in a nutshell, project resources are what you depend on to get the work done. Without them, you cannot get a project done. So this takes us to the concept of resource loading and resource leveling. Resource loading can be described as some activity that involves specifying the types and quantities of the resources required to complete each activity in a project. So you may say, for example, I need 15 person hours or man hours or woman hours of a programmer to write a subroutine for a computer program. Or you might say, well, we need 2 bags of cement and you know, 5 cubic meters of sand for the bricklaying activity, in addition to the brick and the bricklayer. Now, you must note that the resources are loaded not at the project level, but at the activity level. And resources can be identified either by name. So if these are individual human resources, for example, you might say, I need John, you know, who you know is maybe an analyst, a business analyst. Or you might say, well, I just need a system analyst. It could be mentioned generically. Here we have a few examples of types of resource loading. On the top left, you can see an average loading scenario where as time goes on, you just need the same level of resources or input. An example that we may give for this could be, for example, security guards, you know, supermarkets or office blocks that have, say, a need for 1 or more security guards. And of course, the guards will work in shifts, maybe typically 2 or 3 shifts during the 24-hour period, but you will always need, say, two security guards for this particular office block. It's not going to be that daytime, suddenly on a particular day, you need 15 of them. The other type at the bottom left is referred to as a simplest form of resource loading. This is very typical of projects like a construction project. You have a gradual ramping up on the left-hand side of the graph of the resources as things get ready gradually. Then you go through a period where you have constant level of activity at a relatively medium to high level of activity. And then when things are getting ready, you ramp down until you don't need any resources anymore. This could be a production factory shift, for example, or as I mentioned, construction of a house or any facility like that. Then the third type on the right-hand side is the resource loading with a bell curve peak. So here you build up to the activities, but then in the middle, there is a very high level of resources required for a short period, and then it drops down eventually to zero. Maybe an example for this would be, I don't know, the morning taxi rush or restaurants at, say, meal times like lunchtime or dinner time. So, for example, this could be 5:30 in the morning, 6 o'clock, 6:30, but somewhere between 6:37 and 8:30, that's the top sort of peak traffic and rush time. And then gradually it dies down by maybe 9:30, everything is quiet again, and so on. If we look at the other aspect, which is resource leveling, scheduling resources by the earliest possible start date often could lead to an uneven distribution of resources, and that is more likely to call for levels of resource beyond those available. So you do resource leveling when you find that at certain times during your project implementation, you may need too much, more than you have. You may also see that at certain times you are using too few or too little, and some of your resources are getting wasted. So you can adjust the start date of some of the activities, and you can split other activities so that you can get a better distribution of resources. We have an example of that here, where I grabbed these three diagrams for you. Excuse me. A bit of tea to get my voice clear. So here on the top left, you can see the original schedule. This is, I think, a program based on availability of some plant that a project in this company needed. And they are looking at the number of units that are needed here. And these are the days on different days of the project. And as you can see, the maximum number of compressors that they have is 6. But now when they do the project program, they find that on certain days, like day 6 to day 9, they're going to need 7 compressors. And on days 11 and 12, they might need 8 compressors. However, the company only has 6 of them available. So they go through this. The dark blue is the plan that shows, how the final program is. But here, the light blue blocks show you how it was originally planned, and then how they shifted it to the dark blue. For example, this activity D was originally on day 6 to 10, or to 9, sorry, and then they shifted it to go between day 11 and 14, and so on. And by doing that, you then end up with this graph on the top right, which shows you after the resource leveling exercise. Now you can get the job done still, within reasonable time. Now you do not need any more than 6 compressors. However, you do note that instead of finishing on day 20, you finish on day 22. Now, if time is not a constraint, this can work well. But sometimes time is a constraint, and you will have to go out and hire additional compressors, which obviously means you will pay more for it, but you finish within the original time. So this is the idea of resource leveling. Another aspect and another of the resources that we mentioned is financial resources. And here we talk about the concept of asset finance and the role of banks. Obviously, for any project that an organization needs to do, large amounts of capital are required. And if the organization does not have access to, liquid financial resources, the project will be challenged. So here we can see that the advantage of having access to banks that can provide you with asset financing is that it minimizes your risk. It, of course, releases cash. There's additional credit lines available to the organization. The funding can be very efficient. You also reduce uncertainty, you cut waste, and there is faster decision making in the whole process. Now, if we look at analyzing the life cycles of projects, there's something to be noted here when we talk about life cycle of projects. Since part of our discussion centers around purchasing or procurement or supply chain management, when we talk of life cycle of projects, we, in this case, in terms of purchasing, are looking at the concept of project management method life cycle. And the definition of this PMM or project management method life cycle is that we are looking at the stages that any organization will go through when they want to choose a method for managing projects. And then they introduce that method into the organizations, they execute the project using that method's processes, and finally maintaining and enhancing the method. In terms of actual project management methodologies, here is an example of 9 different types. There are other places where they talk of up to 15, but the typical popular ones are, for example, Agile, where in Agile you are collaborating to iteratively deliver whatever works. At the other end of the pendulum, if you like, there is the waterfall approach, which is planning projects fully and then executing through phases. And then there is a number of in between or combination of these. So when in an organization you have a project to do, it might be an IT project, for example, and typically for an IT project, one may go to Agile or Scrum, whereas for construction projects, it is more commonplace to go for a waterfall approach. Once you have selected this, then you will use that methodology to actually do your project. But here, initially, we are talking about the project management method life cycle. And in that life cycle, these are the stages you have. A selection stage, embedding stage, tailoring stage, then operating stage, and the develop stage. So we can discuss these a little bit if you like. The first stage, the selecting stage, for example, is the stage that the company looks at the projects that they have carried out in the past, and they say, well, what are the capabilities and funds and time and so on. And then they select, for example, from those 9 project methodologies that I indicated in the previous slide, they select one of them, and based on the background history they have, they say, okay, which one is more suitable for it. Then you go to next stage, which is the embedding stage. And in the embedding stage, it involves the integration of the project management method with the existing business processes. And then it also involves the assessing of the resources available to the change project. Activities in this stage include setting governance standards, communication of the project management method vision, dissemination of information, gaining the buy-in from staff, training them, and then integration with existing business practices. In stage 3, or the tailoring part, that's once the method has been embedded in the organization, it is available to be used for individual projects. So it is expected that each project will use a version of the embedded method that is suitable for its needs. This process of embedding it for individual projects then is called tailoring. So tailoring can also be described as the process of adapting a method to the context of the project, and is a project level rather than organizational level activities. Now, the activities that are included in the tailoring stage, they include scaling and capability management. After that, we go to the operate stage, and in this operate stage, this is how many people view the project management, the executing of the project to achieve its goals and realize its benefits. Activities in the operate stage are planning, execution, reporting and communication, risk and issue management, and monitoring and control and benefits management. And finally, stage 5, which is the develop stage. This is the final stage in the life cycle, and it relates to how organizations learn and improve the way in which they manage projects. Developing a project management capacity involves feedback to the previous stages of embedding, tailoring, and operating, so that over time, the maturity of the process can be enhanced. Activities in this develop stage are maintenance, internal and external review, and process improvement. So here is a learning exercise, and I think Truman had indicated that we might leave this the direct discussion, but for the colleagues to attend to in on time. Truman?
Absolutely, Suhail. So we are going to skip all the exercises. So what we're going to do, for those that are going to be taking on the course for the certification, we're going to share all these exercises through the e-learning platform, and it will also give you access to the recording as well. Thank you.
So this is the end of the first of the 3 sections. The next section is going to be looking at concept of organizational change. I don't know whether you wish to take some questions here or take a break, or is everybody okay?
Yeah, maybe let's just check with the attendees, all the professionals on the call, the energy levels. Guys, it could be very lonely on this side of the screen. So we'd really appreciate some interaction. And if you are camera ready, just feel free. So do we take a break? Do we continue? What's the general feeling? And this is the time where we get to see who's with us.
Yes, I think the colleagues are all muted. Yeah, I think Sizwe now
Break is good.
ready to give us some feedback, please.
Yep.
Yeah,
Go for it,
maybe
Sizwe.
So maybe 5 minutes. 5 minutes
Okay.
break.
5 minutes. Right.
Okay.
Right. Thank you, Sizwe. So silent would then mean consent, since everyone else is quiet. So we'll take it that we are going to take a 5-minute break. Suhail, I'm going to leave that to you. I think, well, on my side, I'm quite flexible. And looking at the time now, so maybe we can come back at what, 7 o'clock?
7 o'clock, yeah. I'll grab a
Yes.
cup of water as well.
Yes.
Sure.
Thank you.
So you can grab a cup of coffee or a glass of water while we wait just to get some leg stretch. See you shortly.